Hello! In this video, we're going to talk about how to solve a system of equations in 3 variables, and we're going to solve them using matrices. And we're going to be talking about something called reduced row echelon form and also row echelon form you'll see in another video. So this one we're going to focus on the reduced row echelon form. But before we can start solving this system of equations, we first need to understand the rules of what we can do with matrices. So our matrix row operations, right, there's a few things that we can do with matrices. We can switch any 2 rows. So if we have, this top row, this bottom row, notice that all that was changed in the second matrix there was just that it was switched. So that's one of the things we can do. Another thing that we can do is we can multiply one row, right? So rows go across, one row by any non-zero constant. So like in this one, 3 is being multiplied by every single term. And when you write these out, if you're multiplying it by a term, you would write it out in the multiplied form, so 6, 15, and 9. But just to help you see what is happening there, they're multiplying that top row by 3. Notice that the bottom row, nothing changed there. Okay, another thing that we can do with matrices is we can add one row to another row. So notice if I add row 2 to row 3, right, then I get this 3 plus 2, and then the 4 plus 5, and then the 6 plus 3. Right, so I can add those together. I'm just adding each of those rows together. And then, and again, you would write those out, like that would be 5, 9, and 9, right? But that's just to show you how it's adding those together. And then there's also another thing that you can do, and we actually do this a lot, and it's a combination of 2 and 3, where we'll multiply a row by something, and then add it to another row. So it's kind of all in one step. So I want to make sure that you're aware that you can do that combination of things too. Now, when we're trying to solve matrices, we're going to be writing them in this augmented matrix form. And so we're going to take the equation that we have down here, these 3 equations, and we're going to write them in an augmented matrix. And then we want to solve this so that on the left side of the matrix, right, we have a 1, 0, 0 on the top. On the middle row, we get a 0, 1, 0. On the bottom row, a 0, 0, 1. And when we do that, the numbers that end up in this column on the other side of that line, right, this is where the equal signs are. So on the other side, that's what's going to tell us what our x is, what our y is, and what our z is. And notice that these arrows that I have, these are just to help you map out a way to be able to get to all of those different numbers to make those zeros and ones. So when I'm talking about this, I'm saying I want to get a 1 here in the upper left-hand corner. And then the next thing I want to do is go make a 0 underneath it. And then the next thing I want to do is make that 1, that's the smack dab in the middle one. And then move over here to the left there a little bit and make that a 0. All right, go across the bottom, go up the right side, and then over. We'll end with this 0 here. So it's just a good way to kind of help you, have maybe a little system, a little mapping of how to solve using some matrices. So let's go ahead and try that with these equations that I have here. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to write this out as an augmented matrix. So it basically means that I'm going to take out all of the variables and only leave the constant terms in there. And the nice thing about this is that if you have equations that have, 4 variables, 5 variables, 6 variables, by changing it to a matrix, you're able to have like a calculator or a computer or something like that go ahead and solve this matrix. And so we'll only solve things in matrix form up to these, with 3 variables, but in your different fields, you might come across these and have a lot more. Computer science and business, stuff like that, you'll see these for sure. All right, so let's take a look at and write down this as an augmented matrix. So I have 2, -1, 4, and then on the other side of the equal sign, I put this line here to show me where that equal sign is a -3. My second row is a 1, right, because there's just a 1 in front of that x. Notice that there's no y here, so I'll put a 0 in place for that y. -4 and 5. And then my bottom row is going to be 6, -1, 2, and 10. All right, so here is my augmented matrix. And again, remember, I'm trying to get this matrix to look like this one up here in the end, so I can figure out what x, y, and z equal. All right, so we're going to use these row operations, right, these different things to help us do this. So first thing we want to do is we want to get a 1 in that upper left-hand corner, and I see that I have a 1 right below it, so I could start off by just switching these 2 rows with each other, right? So I'm going to just switch, because one of my things that says I can switch any 2 rows. So I'm going to switch these rows so that I get that 1 in the upper left-hand corner where I want it to be. All right, so let's look at that. So I'm going to just rewrite down my matrix again, just the brackets here. And then I can see that my equation 3, I'm not doing anything with, right? That third row is staying the same, so I'm going to go ahead and just put those in there. But equation 1 and equation 2, or this, after I've changed it to matrix, it's a row 1 now and a row 2. I get a 1, 0, -4, 5 on the top. And now my second row is going to be 2, -1, 4, -3. All right, so all I did so far is just switch row 1 and row 2 so I can get that to be a 1 in the upper left-hand corner. All right, then again, after I get that to be a 1, then I want to go and get the number underneath it to be a 0. All right, and there's kind of a few ways to think about how to make 1s and how to make 0s. So I'm going to go ahead and change this, or write a few things here so you can see. So to make 1s, okay, to make a 1, you can multiply the row by its reciprocal. So remember how we can multiply any row by a constant? Well, if we to make a 1, we can multiply that row, by the reciprocal. All right, because remember, if I have 2 numbers, and if they're reciprocals of each other, like 1/3 and 3/1, right, anytime I multiply a number by its reciprocal, I would get 3/3, which reduces to be 1, right? So that's how I'm making a 1, by multiplying by a reciprocal. All right, so that's one of the things. Now we also are going to be making 0s, right? So we want to make sure we know how to make a 0. Well, to make a 0 on this, we are going to either have to add one row to the other row, or we're going to have to do that combination of the 2 and 3, where we multiply it by something and then add it to the other one. So I'm going to just say, to make a 0, right, you're going to use either 3 or 4 over here. So you're going to add one row to another, or you might have to multiply it by a number and then add it to another row. Okay, so these are the two things that we want to make sure that we know how to do. And we said we're trying to make a 0 here, right? And right now we have a 2. So I want you to see if I go ahead and multiply that top row, right? If I was to multiply it by a -2 and then add it to the row 2, I would get a 0 there, which is what I want. So let me write it out to the side here. So I want to do -2 times row 1 plus row 2. Right? So that's what I'm doing on this one. And sometimes when you get working on this, you'll be able to try and, do these in your head, but I'll do a little bit of workout here to the side, starting off, just to make sure you're seeing what I'm doing and how I'm coming up with the numbers that I'm coming up with. All right, so let me do that little side work in a different color. I'll do it in orange over here. So it's telling me that I need to take -2. All right, I'm going to multiply the whole top row by -2. So let me do that first. So that would be -2. All right, -1 or -2 times 1 is -2. 0 times -2 is 0. -2 times -4 is 8. And -2 times 5 is -10. All right. So I get this, and then, so that's that part where I'm multiplying by the -2, but now I need to add it to row 2. So row 2 says 2, -1, 4, -3. All right. Like I said, this is just a little side workout here. Sometimes you can just do this stuff in your head, but I'm putting it here just to make sure everybody's with me on this. So now when I add these rows together, right, because that's the next thing that I said I'm going to be doing there, is I get 0, I get -1, and I get 12, and then -13. And then this becomes my new row 2. Right, because that's what I was adding to. So instead of this row 2 here, right, when I rewrite this down, so let me write another matrix down, give myself a little more room out on the left side here. So my new row 2, just kind of show you like this maybe, is going to be 0, -1, 12, and then -13. All right. And then my top row, my row 1 and my row 3 didn't change. The only thing that I was changing was the row that I was adding to. So I get 1, 0, -4, 5, and then 6, -1, 2, and 10. All right, so now we need to go back up here. Right, let's look back at our mapping. Right, we've got a 1 here, a 0 here. Now we need to go make that very middle one a 1. And right now it's a -1. So remember that I can just multiply my row by a number, right? And that could make and that's going to give me a 1 here if I just multiply this whole row by a -1. So this one we didn't have to really multiply by the reciprocal. I mean, in essence, we really are, but we're going to be multiplying by the opposite here instead, just because it was a -1. All right, so out to the side here, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to multiply -1 by row 2. right? And that's all I'm going to be doing here to change in my next matrix. So my top row, my row 1, and my row 3 are going to stay the same. All right, so let me write this down here. So, and as you work with matrices more, you can kind of, you might be able to skip some steps or do some more things in your head and stuff. But so row 1 didn't change, and row 3 didn't change, but row 2 just need to be multiplied by a negative. So we're basically just changing everything to a negative. Well, 0 doesn't carry a sign, so it just stays 0. We got positive 1, negative 12, and positive 13. All right. All right, so now we've got a 1, 0, 1. Now I need to go make this 6 be a 0. All right, so to do that, I'm going to use this 1 that's in the top row to help me do this, and kind of do what I did up here, where I am going to multiply row 1, this time by a negative 6, so that when I add it to 6, that becomes a 0. All right, so let me write that out to the side here. So I'm going to do negative 6 times row 1 plus row 3 in this case, right? Because I'm trying to change row 3. I want this to become a 0. All right, so let's do a little side work out here again. So if I do negative 6 times my row 1, I get negative 6, 0, and then positive 24, and then negative 30. All right, just distributing that negative 6 through to everybody. And then I'm going to add it to row 3, so that's 6, negative 1, 2, and 10. All right, and so when I add these together, all right, then I got a 0 here, which is what I wanted. Add those together, get negative 1, 26, and then I get negative 20. All right, so again, this is going to be my new row 3 in my next matrix. Okay, so let me write my next matrix down here. Oops. So I've got my new row 3 is going to be 0, negative 1, 26, and then negative 20. And my other 2 rows stay exactly the same. I didn't do any changing of those guys. Okay. I had to multiply the top one by a negative 6, but that didn't end up changing it in the end. The only reason that I did that is so that when I could add it together, I got a 0 here. But really, that still stays the same here. Okay, so now, right, I've got my 1, 0, 1, 0. So now I need to get this negative 1 to be a 0. Well, it looks like if I add row 2 and row 3 together, right, negative 1 plus 1 is going to give me that 0 there where I want it. So that's what I'm going to do on this next one. So I'm just going to take row 2 and add it to row 3. Remember, you're always adding to the one that you're adding to, that second one is the one that's going to be changing. All right, so row 2 plus row 3. Well, let me move. Let's come back up here just so I don't get too far down there. We can kind of see our work a little bit better here. So row 1 stays the same. All right, 0 or 1, 0, negative 4 and 5. Row 2 is going to stay the same. So 0, 1, negative 12 and 13. But row 3 is the one that's changing. So if I add these, and I'll do a little work over here, all right, so I'm doing 0, 1, negative 12 and 13, and I'm adding that to 0, negative 1, 26, and negative 20. right? So then I'm adding those together, and then I end up getting 0, 0, 14, right? Negative 12 plus 26 is 14. And then over here, 13 minus 20 gives me negative 7. Right, so now this is my new row 3 up here. Okay, and maybe I'll just kind of, let's see, that one came down here. Just trying to, I don't know, sometimes the arrows help, maybe sometimes not, but hopefully you'll find those helpful. So now I'm going to have 0, 0, 14, and negative 7. All right, so we're almost halfway there. I know these it seem to take a little while to do and stuff, but especially as we're explaining through it. But all right, so now I need to get that 14 to be a 1. Remember, let's go back up here. All right, we've done all of this. We're now here. All right, I want to make that 14 into a 1. So I'm going to do that by multiplying by the reciprocal. We said to make a 1, we can multiply that row by the reciprocal. Well, the reciprocal of 14 would be 1/14. So I'm going to take and multiply 1/14 by row 3. And some people say it's easier for them to think about division with it, you know, timesing by 1/14 is, when we're doing math, we say that's the same thing as dividing by 14. But technically with matrices, we can't do division, so that's why we're multiplying by its reciprocal. Okay, so let's write our next matrix out here. All right, so when I multiply this bottom row by 1/14, I get 0, 0, 1, and then negative 7, right, times by 1/14 is going to give you negative 1/2. Right? So we get a little fraction there, but that's all right. And then our other two rows stay the same. Okay, so now we've got to get this negative 12 to be a 0. And so again, we're going to follow that, multiply a row by a number and then add it to it. And we always want to come back to these ones. These are going to be so helpful for us when we do this. So I'm thinking, okay, how can I add these guys together? Well, if I take row 3 and I multiply it by a positive 12, and then add it to row 2, that will give me a 0 there, which is what I wanted. Okay, so let's do that out here. So row 3, all right, so I get 0, 0, 12, multiplying the row 3 by 12, and then 12 times negative 1/2 is going to give us a negative 6. All right, and then I'm adding it to my row 2. So that will give me my new row 2, 0, 0, 7. Or sorry, 0, 1, 0, 7. Okay, so let's write that down here. We're so close to being done here now. So 0, 1, 0, and then 7 here. All right, this came down here. But my row 1 and row 3 didn't change. All right, so I've got one number left to change, right? Because that one, the one up there on the top is already a 0, so that's good. So I need to make that negative 4 into a 0 now. And again, to make a 0, I'm going to multiply this row 3 by positive 4 so that when I add those together, I get a 0. So let's do, I'm going to do 4 times row 3 plus row 1. Okay, so when I do 4 times row 3, that will give me 0, 0, 4, and then 1/2, negative 1/2 times 4 is going to be a negative 2. Add it to my row 1, so 1, 0, -4, and 5. So when I add these together, I get 1, 0, 0, 3. And so that will be my new row 1. Whoops. So I get 1, 0, 0, 3. My second row, it's already done, 0, 1, 0, 7. And then my bottom row, 0, 0, 1, -1/2. Okay, and now these are telling me, now that I got it in this form, I can see what my X, Y, and Z are. Because remember, this is my X column, and so this is saying X equals 3. All right, this second column is my Y column, so this is saying Y equals 7. And this last column here are my Z's, and so that's saying 1Z or Z equals -1/2. And so those would be your answers. Okay, I hope you found that helpful.